Thank you so much for having me. Well, it looks a little different this year. As always, it is wonderful to present to the OZeWAI community. Today, my talk focuses on silver, otherwise known as WCAG 3. So I'm going to start by saying that WCAG 3.0 is still very much a work in progress. Today's presentation is meant to highlight and capture where it sits right now. But as with all versions of WCAG, it is not a sprint, but a marathon, and there are quite a few kilometers to go in this run. That being said, I hope that I'm able to shed some light on what we do know. Hopefully, it'll inspire you to read the editor's draft, which was released last month for public comment, and contribute your thoughts and expertise and experience as accessibility professionals and advocates to what is the future standard for digital accessibility. Most of us are familiar with WCAG standing for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. However, for version 3.0 and beyond, WCAG will stand for W3C Accessibility Guidelines. This speaks to the broader scope being encompassed in this version. Web content is obviously limiting to, well, web content. And while there was initially talk about moving away from that familiar acronym of WCAG, the prevailing view was that WCAG was well known and respected. Although we have the new permanent name of WCAG 3.0, for the last few years, the code name used was Silver. It is likely that, at least for a while yet, people will continue to refer to version 3 as Silver. For those of you who don't already know, the reason for the codename Silver is that when the scope of these guidelines were defined as being beyond just web content, the initial thought was to drop the WC in WCAG, which of course left us with AG. And AG is the chemical symbol for silver. As such, the subgroup for the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group at W3C, who have done all the preliminary work on WCAG 3, is known as the Silver Task Force. WCAG 3 is the successor to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.2, or 2.3 should the working group decide to do another version of WCAG 2 in the interim. Well, it will be a newer version when it's ready, and it will be the latest recommendation from the W3C. It won't mean that the previous versions, such as WCAG 2, are in the process of being phased out or not recommended. No doubt, WCAG 2 will continue to play a role in accessibility testing for some time yet. If nothing else, we know governments, laws, policies tend not to change overnight. So while we're touching on WCAG 3 not superseding WCAG 2, it'd probably be remiss of me to not at least touch on WCAG 2.2. So the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group is currently developing WCAG 2.2, and we should be on the lookout for it about mid-2021 for this new version. The structure and content of WCAG 2.2 is the same as 2.1 and 2.0, and the working draft currently provides 9 additional success criteria. In 2.2, success criteria 247, which is visible focus, is going to be changed from a level AA criteria to a level A. The potential new success criteria are 2411, which will become focus appearance minimum, and that will be a AA criteria. And it will require the keyboard focus indicator to have a minimum area, a minimum color contrast ratio, and must not be cause an item with focus to be entirely hidden by author-created content. 2412 will be focus appearance enhanced, which is the AAA criteria of the one I've just previously spoken about, where that minimum area will be higher, as will the color contrast ratio. And no part of the focus indicator can be hidden by author-created content. 2413, basically fixed reference points, and this would require page numbers to match the default version. So this means that users should be able to find their place based on page numbers of the default version of a publication, regardless of, say, zooming the content. So instead of 110 pages, there's 175. 257, dragging. This will ensure that dragging movement can be operated by a single pointer without dragging. Of course, unless dragging is essential. 258, pointer target spacing. So for each target, there will have to be an area, a width and height of at least 44 pixels. That includes it and no other targets. There'll be exceptions for this, like when there's a way to change target spacing, or if the target is in a block of text or a sentence. 326 findable help says that if there are options available, think things like chat, contact details for a person, or self-help option, then access to at least one option is included in the same relative order on each page. 327, hidden controls. So controls that are needed to progress or complete a process are visible at the time that they are needed without requiring any keyboard focus or mouse hover. 337 will be accessible authentication, and this is basically asking that we provide an alternative to authentication and an authentication process if it relies on a cognitive function test. And finally, 338, redundant entry. So this is for steps in a process where a user's entered information that's repeated somewhere else in the process. That instead of having to re-enter your details, it'll auto-populate or be available for the user to select. There'd be exceptions here, of course, for things like security verification, like repeating a password. That would be considered essential in these cases. Okay, so now back to WCAG 3 and how we got to where we are. Lots of research has been taken into account and done for the purposes of developing WCAG 3, including studies and around general usability of WCAG, how UX professionals use it. Our very own Dr. Scott Hollier did research on the Internet of Things. There was also research in conformance and the scope of WCAG, amongst lots of other items. The findings helped the Silver Task Force to determine various elements of the future WCAG 3. The research allowed the task force to really pinpoint a number of goals for what it was, and what is a major overhaul of the guidelines. Things like making WCAG easier to use and understand, and ensuring that there's even more inclusion with varying abilities and perspectives and technologies taken into account, as well as making it easier to maintain and update the guidelines. Also on the list was providing flexibility for organizations and differing types of technology and content. This research and the other extensive work done in the last few years is incredibly important, and it has shaped the why of the decisions that were made, as well as contributing to the development of the prototypes. While the previous versions of WCAG are scoped to web and content, WCAG 3 will include guidance for a broad range of disabilities. This includes particular attention to the needs of low vision and cognitive accessibility, those whose needs don't necessarily tend to fit in the true and false statements of success criteria in WCAG 2. Flexibility to include new and emerging technologies like virtual reality and augmented reality. It will also cover things like software, content management systems, browsers, assistive technology, operating systems, apps for both web and mobile. So WCAG 3 has 3 levels of content. Guidelines, which are solutions to accessibility problems, and they form the top level. These guidelines will be more granular than the guidelines in WCAG 2. Each guideline has outcomes. Outcomes being the desired result or outcome of reducing accessibility problems. This is what you test for. This is to be a similar process, or this is a bit similar, sorry, to success criteria in WCAG 2, but it's more granular. And because it'll be more granular, there'll likely be many more of them. Each outcome will have critical errors and a scoring scale. Every outcome contains multiple methods, which will likely remind you a little bit of WCAG 2 techniques, giving detailed ways to meet an outcome. Other supporting documentation will include how-to documents, which will be a bit like a more detailed and functional version of WCAG 2 understanding documents. Finally, for supporting documents, there will be functional categories of functional needs, which will categorize the needs, the categorized list of the needs of people with disabilities. So let's break this down a little bit more. Guidelines have a descriptive name and summary. They are meant to be easy to understand, which will help with those just starting on their accessibility journey and those who need a high level of understanding. Guidelines talk to functional needs on specific topics like forms or readability. They provide an easy to understand way of organizing and presenting the outcomes so that a non-expert can learn and understand the concepts. Each guideline includes a unique descriptive name along with a high-level plain language summary. As I mentioned earlier, each guideline contains multiple outcomes. Outcomes literally being the outcome from doing things to reduce or get rid of barriers for the user. They will be written as testable criteria, much like success criteria that we're familiar with in WCAG 2. And they'll be closely connected to the needs of people with disabilities. Contained in the outcomes will also be scoring information. I'll go more into this in a little bit when I talk about scoring. For the scope of work, all of the relevant outcomes have to be addressed. That, of course, means that there will be outcomes which don't apply. So when an outcome does not apply, it can be marked as not applicable or NA in the scoring, which is something we can't do now in WCAG 2. The other thing worth mentioning here is some outcomes will include related critical errors and how to identify them. Any critical errors would then attract the lowest score of the outcome for the outcome. These errors would be things like flashing items or a keyboard trap, basically something that stops the user completely from progressing, operating, or perceiving the content. In short, these will most likely be used by technical experts like testers and developers. Every outcome has one or more methods. I think of methods as detailed solutions. So they break down into 3 types. All, which are methods that apply across all technologies. Technology specific, so these are methods that apply to one of a predetermined list of technologies like HTML or VR or PDF. Fallback methods are methods that can apply to emerging or proprietary technology, and for technology that doesn't yet have a method. The methods include detailed information on how to meet the outcome, working code examples, detailed examples, resources, as well as information about testing, including step-by-step instructions and info on how to score individual instances of the test. The testing results for methods inform the rating of the related outcome. The how-to documentation is like a really great functional understanding document. It provides information organized with tabs for get started, plan, design, develop, examples, resources. Explaining how to apply the concepts in plain language for non-technical readers, it gives a great summary of not just the guideline, but why it's important, who it helps, and the relevant information for project managers and designers and developers. It also includes examples and the outcomes from meeting a guideline. As part of the user-centric approach, the guidelines are developed on a basis of functional needs. Functional needs are a statement on a specific access barrier that a user may face. These functional needs are applied to topics like contrast, for example, to identify the barriers experienced by people with disabilities. The barriers inform the outcomes, which directs the test to ensure the functional needs have been met. Functional needs can be found in the how-tos. Functional categories are groups of disability types. These are used when reporting test results in a conformance claim. So the current list of functional categories is evolving, but it'll include things like visual and vision, hearing and auditory, mobility, language and literacy, learning, memory, mental health, and plenty more. So there are going to be 2 different types of tests. Atomic tests will test content typically at like an item or an object level. These would include existing tests that support success criteria in WCAG 2. In version 3, atomic tests will be used to test both processes or journeys and views. As is the case now with WCAG 2 testing, some of the atomic tests can be automated, but manual testing is still needed. The other type of test will be holistic tests. Holistic tests include assistive technology testing and things like user testing. The points from holistic testing do not affect the scores of the atomic tests. However, there will be a minimum of holistic tests that will need to be met in order to reach higher rates of compliance. Scoring is rated on a scale of 0 to 4. This model is meant to be flexible to allow for more functional needs of people with disabilities to be included in the guidelines. Every outcome defines the rating criteria used for the outcome. And the rating criteria will also leave room so a tester and auditor is able to make an informed judgment call. Besides pass and fail statements, WCAG 3 will include other testing options like rating scales. This is because one of the goals here has been to expand scoring tests of methods beyond the binary true or false choice that we have at page level now. Still, in most cases, testing individual items will probably have a pass or fail result. Items scored that can then be counted, numbers passed or number of instances to come up with a percentage. The important thing to remember here is any critical errors would result in a score of 0 or very poor. The potential thresholds for ratings of a test may be, and these could change. So 0 being very poor, so any critical errors, or less than 50% of related test pass. Poor, which is 1, no critical errors and approximately 50 to 79% of related test pass. Fair, again, no critical errors and approximately 80 to 89% of the related test pass. Good, no critical errors, approximately 90 to 98% of the related test pass. And excellent, 4, which would be no critical errors and approximately 99 to 100% of related test pass. Again, this is part of the editor's draft that is still in progress. After all the outcomes have been scored, the ratings are averaged for a total score and the score by the functional categories they support. The conformance model drafted is very different from WCAG 2. Like the rest of version 3, it's meant to be more flexible as well as more user-centered. In this model, processes or journeys take center stage. So if I were a local council, for example, the journey to say register my dog would be an important process. Outcomes are rated, as I spoke about, beyond just the pass and fail using that 0 to 4 scale, and the ratings are averaged for a total score. On top of that, there is also a score for each of the functional categories. The levels are different. So while in WCAG 2, the levels are single A, double A, triple A, in WCAG 3, they will be bronze, silver, and gold. While the basic idea is the higher the rating scores, the higher the level of compliance, it is more complex than that. Guidelines will be broken down into categories based on different disabilities and user interactions. And to be compliant, a site must have a minimum number of points in every category. At the bronze level, the digital product would need to have no critical errors, at least a 3.5 total score, as well as at least a score of at least 3.5 under each of the functional categories. In order to gain silver or gold levels, you would need to use the holistic tests and the scoring, which hopefully will mean that we'll see more user testing by people with disabilities. So what does the timeline look like? Well, the timeline's pretty fluid, but I can tell you that last month in November, the first public working draft was published. Over the next couple of years, work will focus on refining the structure and conformance model. Once those are more stable, the accessibility requirements like guidelines and outcomes will be further developed, and a complete draft may be available in late 2022. That brings us to a late 2023, where we may have a WCAG 3.0 published as a final standard. The Silver Task Force is still seeking input from evaluators, developers, designers, project managers, policymakers, people with disabilities, and well, anyone, particularly on how clear the structure is and useful, how well does the conformance model work across different situations, and there are questions actually throughout the draft when you read it through. If you're interested in helping to shape WCAG 3, I really want to encourage you to review the draft and submit comments if you can. And there's a whole background section for you to read, which will give you some context as well. If you want to wait until WCAG 3 is a little bit more polished and stable to start learning it, you certainly can. There should be later drafts available in 2021 and 2022. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for having me once again. I'll be around throughout the conference, and I'm happy to chat with you about this or anything else.